you need an ideal because you have nothing to aim at, but an ideal is a judge, and you always fall short of the ideal. So how the hell can you have the benefits of having an ideal without having the crushing blow that goes along with having the judge that always regards you as insufficient? So I was trying to work that out in the chapter, and this is something I've had to work out a lot as a clinical psychologist. It's like, well, let's say you need a goal, but we don't want to let your distance from the goal crush you. So you got to set up a goal, and then you got to break the goal down into parts so that you can move towards it, and you have a fairly high likelihood of doing it. So that's a bit of practical, I wouldn't say advice, it's because it's better than advice. It's some practical knowledge about how to go about achieving an aim. Set a high aim, but differentiate it down so you know what the next step is, and then make the next step difficult enough so you have to push yourself past where you are, but also provide yourself with a reasonable probability of success. It's also what you do with children, right? You want to push them because they need to grow up and be more than they are, right? But you don't want to crush them with constant failure. So what you do is aim high and make the goal difficult but proximal. So that's one way of looking at it. But then the next thing is, I've had clients, many clients in their 30s, who are trying to, this is more true with women, I would say. A lot of women who are very high achieving and who established their career goals at 30 and then want to differentiate out their life. They want to have a husband, they want to have a family, they're trying to figure out how to do that. And one of the things I've noticed that around 30, you really have to stop comparing yourself in some ways to other people. And the reason for that is that the particularities of your life are so idiosyncratic that there isn't anyone really all that much like you, because the details of your life happen to matter. And so maybe you compare yourself to some rock star or something like that, and the person's rich and famous and glamorous and all that, but they're alcoholic and they use too much cocaine and they've had 3 divorces, and it's like, how the hell do you make sense out of that? Is that someone that you should judge yourself harshly against or not? The answer is you don't know, because you don't know all the details of their lives. And who do you know that you can compare yourself to? That's easy. You. Yesterday. So here's a good goal. It's something like, well, aim high. And I really mean that. It's like, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. Aim high, but use as your control yourself. It's like, so your goal is to make today some tiny increment better than yesterday. And you can use better. You can define better yourself. This doesn't have to be some imposition of external morality. You know where you're weak and insufficient, where you could improve. You think, okay, well, this is what I'm like yesterday. If I did this little thing, things would be just an increment better. And, well, that's a great thing because you get the ball rolling, and incremental improvement is unstoppable. You can actually implement it, and it starts to generate Pareto distribution-like consequences. It starts to compound. And I've seen that happen in people's lives over and over. People write me all the time and tell me that they're doing that, but I've seen that happen in people's lives continually. They make a goal that, the goal should be, how could I conceive of my life so that if I had that life, it would clearly be worth living, so I wouldn't have to be bitter, resentful, deceitful, arrogant, and vengeful. Like, that's sort of the bottom line, right? Because that's what endless failure does to you. It's not good. And that's what life without purpose and a goal does to you as well, because life is very hard. So you think, okay, well, I need to adopt a mode of being that would justify my suffering. And you can ask yourself that question. What would make this worthwhile? I quote Nietzsche, I think, in that chapter. He said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." That's a lovely line, man. I mean, it's a lovely line. And it's really worth thinking about. So you think, well, how do I manage all this misery and suffering and futility? It's like, well, I need to figure out what I would have to do in order to make that clearly worthwhile. And so then you have your goal, and then you think, well, I need to move towards that incrementally because I'm kind of useless and can only do so much and maybe not even that. But all I have to do is be a little bit better than my miserable self yesterday. And that'll propel you forward very rapidly. And you can succeed at it, which is also really lovely, because why not set yourself up for success, because otherwise you'll droop around like a number 10 lobster. And, that's just not good. You get all pinchy when that happens, and it's not a good thing. So imagine you're dealing with someone who's hoarding. Now, people who are hoarding are often older or neurologically damaged, or they have obsessive compulsive disorder. But then you walk into their house and there's like 10,000 things in their house. there's maybe 100 boxes, and you open up a box, and in the box there's some pens and some old passports and some checks and their collection of silver dollars and some hypodermic needles and some dust and, a dead mouse. And there's boxes and boxes and boxes like that in the house. It's absolute chaos in there. Absolute chaos, not order. Chaos. And then you think, is that their house or is that their being? Is that their mind? And the answer is, there's no difference. There's no difference. So, I could say, well, if you want to organize your psyche, you could start by organizing your room. If that would be easier, because maybe you're a more concrete person and you need something concrete to do. So you go clean up under your bed and you make your bed and you organize the papers on your desk and you think, well, just exactly what are you organizing? Are you organizing the objective world, or are you organizing your field of being, like your field of total experience? And Jung believed that, and I think there's a Buddhist doctrine that's sort of nested in there, that at the highest level of psychological integration, there's no difference between you and what you experience. Now you think, well, I can't control everything I experience, but that's no objection because you can't control yourself anyway. So the mere fact that you can't extend control over everything you experience is no argument against the idea that you should still treat that as an extension of yourself. Well, let's say you have a long-standing feud with your brother. Well, is that a psychological problem? Is that him? Is it a problem in the objective world, or is it a problem in your field of being? And it's very useful to think that way, because you might ask, what could you do to improve yourself? Well, let's step one step backwards. The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to. And maybe so others don't have to either. It's something like that. Like there's a real injunction at the bottom of it. It's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. And you could say, well, I don't care about that, but that's actually not true. You actually do care about that, because if you're in pain, you will care about it. And so you do care about it, even if it's just that negative way. It's very rare that you can find someone who's in excruciating pain who would ever say, well, it would be no better if I was out of this. Sort of pain is one of those things that brings the idea that it would be better if it didn't exist along with it. It's incontrovertible. So you get your act together so that there isn't any more stupid pain around you than necessary. Well, so then the question might be, well, how would you go about getting your act together? And the answer to that, and this is a phenomenological idea too, it's something like, look around for something that bothers you and see if you can fix it. You can do this in a room. It's quite fun to do it just when you're sitting in a room, like a room, maybe your bedroom. You can sit there and just sort of meditate on it and think, okay, if I wanted to spend 10 minutes making this room better, what would I have to do? And you have to ask yourself that, right? It's not a command. It's like a genuine question. And things will pop out in the room that there's a stack of papers over there that's kind of bugging you, and you know that maybe little order there would be a good thing. And, there's some rubbish behind your computer monitor that you haven't attended to for like 6 months, and the room would be slightly better if it was a little less dusty and the cables weren't all tangled up the same way. And if you allow yourself just to consider the expanse in which you exist at that moment, there'll be all sorts of things that'll pop out in it that you could just fix. And, I might say, well, if you were coming to see me for psychotherapy, this easiest thing for us to do first would just be to get you to organize your room. You think, well, is that psychotherapy? And the answer is, well, it depends on how you conceive the limits of your being. And I would say, start where you can start. If something announces itself to you, which is a strange way of thinking about it, as in need of repair, that you could repair, then, hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. I often tell people, too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial, right? You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do. Hands down. All you have to do is do the arithmetic. You figure it out right away. So 100 adjustments to your broader domain of being, and there's a lot less rubbish around and a lot fewer traps for you to step into. And so once you've got your mind and your emotions together, and once you're acting that out, then you can extend what you're willing to consider yourself and start fixing up the things that are part of your broader extent. It's a very interesting thing to do. I like the idea of the room because you can do that at the drop of a hat. You go back to where you live and sit down and think, okay, I'm going to make this place better for half an hour. What should I do? You have to ask. And things will just pop up like mad. And it's partly because your mind is a very strange thing. As soon as you give it a name, a genuine aim, it'll reconfigure the world in keeping with that aim. That's actually how you see to begin with. And so if you set it a task, especially, you have to be genuine about it, which is why you have to bring your thoughts and emotions together, and then you have to get them in your body so you're acting consistently. You have to be genuine about the aim, but once you aim, the world will reconfigure itself around that aim, which is very strange. And it's technically true. The best example of that, you have all seen this video where you watch the basketballs being tossed back and forth between members of the white team versus the black team. And while you're doing that, a gorilla walks up into the middle of the video and you don't see it. It's like, if you thought about that experiment for about 5 years, that would be about the right amount of time to spend thinking about it. Because what it shows you is that you see what you aim at. And that, man, if you can get one thing through your head as a consequence of even being in university, that would be a good one. You see what you aim at. And so because one inference you might draw from that is, be careful what you aim at, right? What you aim at determines the way the world manifests itself to you. And so if the world is manifesting itself in a very negative way, one thing to ask is, are you aiming at the right thing? Now, I'm not trying to reduce everybody's problems to an improper aim. People get cut off at the knees for all sorts of reasons. They get sick, they have accidents. There's a random element to being, that's for sure. And so you don't want to take anything, even that particular phrase, too far. You want to bind it with the fact that random things do happen to people. But it's still a great thing to ask.
Why do you think they're not more careful in drawing a line between what's legal and acceptable, at least legally, and what's illegal and sadistic and criminal? Is there something about, okay, so here's part of the reason I'm asking this question. So I spent a lot of time studying the perceptions and actions of very, very pathological people. And one of the things that is interesting about serial sexual killers, for example, is that their behavior tends to accelerate across time. And there's a very specific reason for this. So sex has an intrinsically rewarding nature, but that the nature of anything that's rewarding can be heightened by novelty. So because novelty itself, if it's in the right dose, is also gives you a dopaminergic kick. Sexual anticipation and sexual pleasure produce a dopaminergic kick, but novelty heightens that. Okay, so what that tends to mean, especially if you're overdoing it, let's say, is that you want to stay on the novelty edge, right? So what you see with serial killers, for example, who have a sexually sadistic twist is that the sadistic element in their crime accelerates across time as they search for that edge to stay where things are maximally gratifying. And so there's reasonable evidence that the same thing applies to pornography use online, is that maybe it starts out with relatively vanilla displays, but then it progresses to more and more graphic displays, and then past graphic, there's kinky, and past kinky, there's violent, and past violent, there's violent and kinky, and that's not as far as it goes. And so you can also see this culturally. Theodore Dalrymple, who's a very interesting British essayist, made a lot of this when he was talking about how porn invaded our culture, that the borders were, what would you say, moved bit by bit, really starting in the 1920s. He identified a famous case. Who was the novelist? Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned as a pornographic novel in Great Britain, and it was quite sexually graphic, especially for the time. And that ban was overthrown, and he thought of that as although Dalrymple is a free speech advocate, he thought of that, the victory of, I can't remember who the author was, actually quite a renowned author, the victory for his novel as the entry point of the pornographication of the culture. Okay, but over the course of my life, I've seen in our culture the same thing that happens to people who become increasingly sexually perverse as they chase the novelty edge. Because when I was very young, let's say, it was Playboy that broke the barrier fundamentally, right? That was Hugh Hefner, and Playboy was a relatively sophisticated magazine for a porn magazine. Most of the images of women were nudes, but not sexually explicit nudes, merely nudes. And there was a lot of journalism in Playboy and some very good writing. And Hefner kind of marketed that as bohemian 1950s, freedom and equality between men and women, the cool single person who was willing to explore their sexuality in a creative manner. And that was Playboy. And of course, that empire lasted for quite a long time. But then after Playboy came Penthouse, and Penthouse was much more sexually graphic, a lot more explicit. And after Penthouse came Hustler, and Hustler started to move into you might call it into the domain of severely bad taste. And that was certainly the case. And then, by the time then Hustler metamorphosed into, dozens and dozens of magazines that concentrated on every fetish you could possibly imagine. And then the internet came along, and it was the case that the expansion of the internet was actually facilitated in a major way by the desire of isolated and socially incompetent men to share sexually graphic images. I mean, the whole internet was driven at, we know what, 1/3 to 40% of the traffic on the internet is pornographic still. And so it was an incredible, the sexual element was an incredible motivating factor for the development of the worldwide net. And there's a lot of criminal activity on the net, maybe 50% of it, right? And it's very hard to hold people accountable. So what we're seeing is our whole culture chasing that novelty edge, and that's all driven by, in the worst cases, narcissistic, psychopathic, Machiavellian, sadistic criminals, and we can't hold them accountable. It's really bad. It's really bad. Okay, so now...
But we can hold those who are distributing it accountable.
Okay. Can we?
Yes, we absolutely can.
Who are these people?
Well, first I want to kind of just, basically acknowledge what you just said is absolutely true, is that today on these free porn tube sites, again, free, you just, there wasn't even an Are You 18 click-through button at the beginning of 2020 where any 7-year-old could just click right through, end up on the homepage of Pornhub or X videos for free. And what they're seeing on the homepage is not your father's Playboy, right? It's not the images that you were describing. It is, there was a study done that was published in the British Journal of Criminology, and they analyzed the home pages of these sites. And when you get onto Pornhub, there's about 50 videos that you will see that if you scroll over, they autoplay. And these are these homemade user-generated videos, and they found that 1 in 8 of those videos was displaying sexual violence, videos that would include non-consent, incest. And I think that is just so alarming that is the reality that we're living in today.
America's healthcare system is lacking in any real care. Insurance companies regularly deny progressive treatment options, primary care physicians refuse to order comprehensive lab work, and the standards of care lag years behind the leading research. That's where Merrick Health comes in. Merrick Health represents a paradigm shift in how we approach medicine. The premier health optimization platform, Merrick Health empowers you to maximize your longevity and performance with the confidence that comes from having experts in your back pocket. They offer cutting-edge diagnostic labs, concierge health coaching, and expert clinical oversight. They help you achieve your health and fitness goals by leveraging data-driven lifestyle and nutrition recommendations, along with supplement and prescription treatment options. If you're listening to this show, then you're probably a proponent of taking your health into your own hands. That's why we've teamed up with Merrick Health to offer a turnkey optimization package designed for those who want to maximize their performance and longevity with the most elaborate testing on the market. You'll receive extensive lab work, thorough lab reports, video calls with Merrick's health experts, and expedited onboarding. Go to merrickhealth.com/Peterson and use code Peterson to get the same panel and medical oversight I get and save 10% at checkout. That's merrickhealth.com/Peterson and use code Peterson at checkout.
Well, exposure also desensitizes, right? So if you're a therapist and you want to reduce the anxiety that someone feels, well, I can give you an example. I had a client one time who was a vegetarian, and but this person was a vegetarian because they were really terrified of life and of death and couldn't go into a grocery store. And so because of the displays of meat, and one of the things that I did was bring them to a store that was closer and closer to an actual butcher store and have them look, because that's what you do. You have people look at what it is that they're terrified of. And if they do that voluntarily, their anxiety levels decrease. Actually, they become braver, but fundamentally, you could say as well that their anxiety levels decrease. And so the revulsion that young people would feel for violent acts is, especially on the sexual side, is going to be reduced as a consequence of that kind of voluntary exposure. And God only knows what that does. I mean, I can't imagine. And it's an unbelievably powerful force too. You know, we're in a situation now where a 13-year-old boy, because it's going to be boys, mostly men using these sites because men are much more sensitive to visual stimuli. Women seem to prefer literary pornography.
Although there are many, it's increasing in the number of girls.
Do you know what the proportion is by any chance?
No, I don't know that exact proportion.
Yeah.
I do know it's still boys primarily that are primarily being exposed, but girls as well are consuming this kind of content at very young ages as well.
Yeah, well, curiosity is going to drive that to some degree. Right? There's a great book by the Google engineers called A Billion Wicked Thoughts. Do you know that book?
No, I don't.
Oh, that's I think the best book I've ever read, investigating the use of the sex difference, for example, and the use of pornography. It's a very smart book. And so, we're in a situation right now where the typical 13-year-old boy can see more beautiful nude woman than any man ever saw in history, right? Incredibly powerful, possibly irresistible stimulus package. And we also don't know exactly what that's doing to the relationships between young men and young women, sexually and otherwise, right? There is increasing evidence, especially in countries like Japan and South Korea, although the transformation curves seem to be playing out the same way in the rest of the West, except delayed. There's a tremendously high rate of virginity now in Japan. I think it's something like 30% of Japanese young people, 30 and under, have never had any sexual encounter whatsoever. The relationship scene is fragmenting in those countries. The birth rate has absolutely plummeted. And we have no idea what the connection is between that and the very straightforward and simple sexual gratification that's available online. We also have no idea how it is that young people's sexual preferences are trained as a consequence of their exposure to online pornography. And so is it cataclysmic? Probably. It's an insanely powerful technology. And I've been thinking about this too, is that we misapprehend what's happening because it's easy to think that the women on Pornhub, for example, who are participating, the men as well, are just women, but they're not women in a way. They're women-machine hybrids, because no woman can be in a million rooms at the same time. And you can think about that also with regard to sites like OnlyFans, is the women have been transformed into images that can be propagated everywhere. And that's a insane technological revolution. And it's also very possible for young women to monetize their beauty, right? And tempting for them to do that because, well, a small proportion of them can make a very large amount of money, and in a manner that appears easy and also that draws a lot of attention. And so if you have a narcissistic tilt, or if you've been isolated and are lonely and need attention, then that's a hell of a way to get it.
When you're in chaos and you don't know what's going on, then you start imagining what might be going on. And that imagination is partly the world as it might be, but it's also partly the structure of your unconscious mind, which is producing the fantasies. And so when you're truly in chaos, then the distinction between your fantasies and reality isn't clear. That's actually part of what constitutes the chaos. So imagine this. So you're in a relationship and the person betrays you. And you knew who they were, or at least you thought you did, before that moment. But now you're looking at them and you don't know who they are. And you don't know what the past was. And you don't know what the present is. And you don't know what the future is going to be. All of that's been thrown up into the air in a major way. That's traumatic. So much has fallen apart that it's traumatic. So what do you start to do? You start to imagine what might be the situation. The reality is your imagination and the reality at the same time. They're not pulled apart at all. You cannot distinguish between them. So Pinocchio is in this situation that's half fantasy and half reality, in this chaotic state. And he has to go down to find the thing that he least wants to find. He's got this intuition that in facing that thing, that chaos that life really is, that chaos, that he's going to find his father and reunite with him. So you could also say that in some sense it's a decision of faith, I suppose, because you might ask yourself, well, why bother confronting chaos? If chaos is the ultimate reality, then what the hell use is there in facing it? Because it's just going to reveal itself as the ultimate reality and drown you. But the myths always say the same thing. They say, no, if you confront what's really disturbing you, if you really confront it, you do it voluntarily, you're going to find order in it eventually. Or at least that's the only way you're going to find order. Now, it's not like these stories are optimistic, and it's not as if they give you a sure guide to success. That's the other thing. It's not like they're unerringly accurate, because you can be subsumed by chaos that's so total that even if you face it, you're not going to prevail. I mean, that's why people die. That's one way of looking at it anyways. But the mythology basically says this is your best bet. If there's a process that's going to work, this is it. And then you might think, well, the better you do it, the better the chances are of success, or the more consistently you do it, the better the chances of success are. And I think that that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at it. So anyways, Pinocchio's down at the bottom of the ocean, and every time he says he's trying to find out where Monstro is, and they ask questions to the fish that are down there, but every time they mention Monstro's name, all the fish disappear. It's like Voldemort, right? He's the guy whose name you cannot say. And Monstro is precisely that. It's the thing that frightens everyone. And so asking questions down there isn't helping very much. And so Pinocchio, what he does is he's calling for his father, and he keeps going deeper and deeper into the depths. And there's a scene where the darkness of the ocean turns into an even more profound darkness, and that's what Pinocchio disappears into. And then we see Monstro. He's in this sort of foggy representation, this huge thing that lies very much at the bottom. And there's no life or anything around him except, I think these are mackerel, but there's no life down there. He's so far down at the bottom of the ocean that there's nothing that's alive down there. And then we go inside the whale, which is of course absurd, and we see that the whale has eaten a boat at some point in the past. This is one whopping whale. And Geppetto is sitting with the kitten, of all things. He's also got that little goldfish bowl full of goldfish with him too, which is quite the feat. Anyways, he's sitting there and he knows that he's trapped in the belly of the whale too, and that he can't get out. And so that's an interesting issue. It's because not only is Pinocchio lacking his father, which isn't a good thing, but the father is lacking the son. And there's some indication that the father can't get out of the whale without the son. And so it's like the possibility for order is down there in this chaotic state, but unless there's an active agent to go seek it out, it's not animated enough to get out by itself. You know, and you could say, well, there's wisdom in the libraries, but without you going in there and gathering it and embodying it, all it does is sit there in potential, in all of that implicit form. That's a good way of thinking about it. So anyways, Geppetto is pretty hopeless because he can't figure out any way of getting out of the whale, and he's also starving. He's starving in the belly of the whale. And here's a way of thinking about that. Geppetto's a good guy, but he's old. And that means his way of doing things is no longer fruitful. That's why he's starving. And it's especially not fruitful because he's missing his son. He's missing the active element that the child represents, say the playful and transformative element that the child represents. And so if you get stuck doing something the same old way, at some point it's no longer going to work. Even if it was good at some point, it has to be updated. And it's updated by, let's call it the spirit of youth or the spirit of attention or the spirit of play, something like that. The willingness to break boundaries and take risks. And Geppetto is very, very skilled, but he doesn't have that. And that's symbolized by the loss of his son. That's why he was out looking for his son too. He needs him. And so they're in despair down there, trying to fish and not getting anything. And so Monster wakes up and he opens his mouth and a bunch of water starts to come in. And then you see Pinocchio with the fish. Now, you may remember, and perhaps you don't. How can you tell if the person you're in a romantic relationship with is the right person to spend the rest of your life with? You can't. You actually decide that rather than discovering it. I might suggest what you might look for on the way to making that decision. All things considered, a certain amount of similarity on the personality dimensions between the two of you is probably to be recommended. If you differ tremendously in trait conscientiousness, one of you is going to find the other unbearably rigid, orderly, and workaholic-oriented, and that person is going to find you dissolute and undisciplined. And those are temperamental differences, and if the gap is large, it's hard to bridge it. Agreeableness, it's the same thing. The warmer person will find the colder, harsher person cruel and unkind, and the cruel and unkind person will find the more agreeable person soft, a pushover, and contemptibly unable to stand up for themselves. The extrovert will want to be out partying all the time, and the introvert will have had his or her fill of that very rapidly. So you want some temperamental similarity across the major personality dimensions, with the possible exception of trait neuroticism, which is the generalized proclivity to experience negative emotion. I would suggest that a person high in neuroticism seek out someone low or very low, because first of all, neuroticism is one of the best predictors of unhappiness in a relationship. And so if you're both high in neuroticism, you're very likely to be unhappy in the relationship. And it's highly probable that the person who's higher in neuroticism needs the stabilizing influence of someone who's lower. Then I would say, well, this is based on my clinical observations as well as the experiences of my life. I think it's necessary, or at least highly desirable, that you find the person that you're with sexually attractive. And that's somewhat ineffable. You can be confronted with two people who are, by objective standards, equally attractive or perhaps equally unattractive, and find yourself very physically attracted to one of them while the other one will leave you cold. And that's a deep mystery. And I've seen couples who get along as friends, try to bridge that romantic gap by will. And I haven't really seen it be successful. So I think you need that spark that ignites sexual passion. Then you have to ask yourself if you can trust the person.
if there are activities that you can share with them that would make up a life, if you're oriented in approximately the same direction with regard to your goals, especially important goals, career and children being foremost among them, if you think you could come to some agreement about how the economic resources could be distributed, or at least how that might be negotiated, if you can negotiate with the other person, and again, if you can trust them. And I would say of all those, trust is the most crucial component, maybe followed by the ability to negotiate. The right person is someone you can negotiate with, because there's going to be differences between you and them. There's going to be differences in your approach. There should be, hopefully there'll be, because that means that the two of you are bringing different skill sets to bear on the problem. That means that you have a more diverse range of potential responses, which can be good, but also that there's going to be conflict. The issue then becomes, can you negotiate through the conflicts? And will the other person stick to their negotiated solution? And then if you find someone like that and they're of approximately the right age and everything else seems to be in order, then in some sense, they're as good a bet as the next person, and life doesn't last forever. And so there's real reasons to get on with it. You have to understand that even in the best relationships are predicated on attraction, trust, and negotiation. And it's constant. You're constantly negotiating to maintain the relationship, to expand it. You don't find the right person and live happily ever after. Life is far too complicated for that.
You learn through voluntary contact with that frightens or disgusts you. Carl Jung said his primary dictum was insterquilinus invenitur, which I'm sure I'm massacring because it's Latin, but it meant in filth it will be found. You always learn when you're wrong, which is very annoying. Now, what do you learn when you're correct? You're walking in the world, you're operating in the world, you have a sense of what you want to have happen. You're always looking at the world through this sense of what you want to have happen. You're acting so that what you want to have happen will happen. And when it happens, well, then you're happy because, well, first of all, you get what you want, and that's good, maybe, depending on what you want. But it's also good because if you get what you want when you act, then it turns out that your model of how to act is valid, right? The outcome that you get what you want indicates no error on the part of your model. But it's very frequently the case that when you act to get what you want, you don't get what you want. And then that's unpleasant because you don't get what you want. But it's even more unpleasant because it brings with it the hint of a suggestion that the manner in which you're construing the world is incorrect at some indeterminate level. So, for example, if you tell a joke at a party, you presume that people will attend, and then when they hear the joke, they will laugh. And then if you tell the joke and it goes flat, or even worse, disgusts and offends people, then you're going to be taken aback. And that's partly because you didn't get what you want, and that's not so good. But it's more because there's something wrong with the way you conceptualize the situation. And then you're faced with a problem, and the problem is the emergence of a domain of the unknown. It's like, well, what kind of mistake did you make? Maybe you're not as funny as you think you are. That could be a big problem. Maybe you're not around people who are the way you think they are. Maybe they don't like you as much as you thought they liked you. I mean, the potential for various paranoid thoughts of increasing severity to come welling up at you in a situation where you make even a trivial social mistake is quite broad. And when you make an error of that sort, you have to face it and sort through all the possibilities so that you can find out what it was that you did wrong and how to retool it so that in the future you don't make the same mistake. You have nothing to rely on in your life that's more crucial to your success as you move through life than your character and your personality. That's what you bring to every situation. And the more sophisticated you are in relationship to yourself and others, the more you understand people, the deeper you understand the nature of your own being, the more likely it is that you're going to proceed through your life in a manner that will make you pleased to exist rather than displeased to exist. As you interact with other people, you inevitably tell them what you want and what you don't want. When they give you what you want and what you admire, you respond positively to them, you pay attention to them, you smile at them, you focus your thoughts on them, you interact with them, and you reward them for acting in a particular manner. And when they don't respond the way that you want, then you punish them with a look, or by turning away, or by rejecting their friendship, or when you're a child, by refusing to play with them. And so we're engaged in the co-creation of personalities, our own and others. And that also brings up the same question. What is it that we are all collectively trying to be and trying to create? Honest communication between two people can produce personality transformation. And you know, you might think, well, you kind of know that already because there's something very engaging about a deep, honest conversation where you're able to say things that you wouldn't normally say, where you're being listened to by someone who's actually listening to you and you're listening to them. And in the conversation, you're moving both of you further to a different point. That's different than a conversation where you're right and you're trying to convince me, or I'm right and I'm trying to convince you, which I would say is the typical conversation. The healing conversation is more, well, what's up with you? You know, how are you doing? How's your life going? What sort of problems are you facing? What do you think about those problems? Can you conceptualize what a solution might be? Is there a way we could figure out how to get there? You know, it's a problem-solving conversation, and it's predicated on the presupposition that the person that you're conversing with has the capacity to grow in a positive direction if they so choose. There's lots of different places that you can act in the world, and there's lots of different ways you can look at it and survive. That's why you can be a plumber and a lawyer and an engineer, and those all work, right? Even though they're very different modes of being. And you can have different personalities and survive as long as you're capable of finding the place where your particular filters and behavioral proclivities match the demand of the environment. And a huge part, I would say, of successful adaptation is precisely that. I believe that you need to know what the world is made of, and I suppose that's the proper domain of science, but then you need to know how to act. And that's a whole different thing. And you need to know how to act. That's the thing you need to know most of anything, because of course you're a living creature, and action in relationship to desired goals is everything to you. And you can think about that from a Darwinian perspective. You have to act at least so that you can survive, at least so that you can find a partner. That's life. And so part of the question is, well, how does the world look if you think about it as a place to act? And the answer isn't a place of value-free objects. That's not what the world looks like. And you can't act in a world of value-free objects because there's no way of choosing between them. If everything has zero value, why would you choose one thing over another? You live in a world where things present themselves to you as of different value. You make yourself out of the information that you gather in the world. So you're an exploring creature. You explore specifically when the maps that you're using in the world are no longer orienting yourself properly, when they're producing errors. You go out and gather information and assemble yourself from the information that you discovered. There's some relationship between your personality and the manner in which your brain functions. I've often found it useful when I'm trying to remember something to have a story to hang the facts on. Otherwise, you're faced with the necessity of doing nothing but memorization. And it isn't obvious to me that memorization actually constitutes knowledge. What constitutes knowledge is the generation of a cognitive structure that enables you to conduct yourself more
appropriately in life. And so I suppose you might say that you could argue that a course in psychology, especially in personality, is a course in applied wisdom as well, assuming that wisdom is in part your capacity to understand yourselves so that you don't present too much of an intolerable mystery to yourself, and also to understand others so that you can predict their behavior, understand their motivations, negotiate with them, listen to them, and formulate joint games with them so that you can integrate yourself reasonably well with another person and with a family and in society. You have to figure out ways of simplifying the world, right? Because you just can't do everything. And so people are specialized. They have specialized niches that they occupy. You could think about them as social niches. A niche is a place where your particular skills would serve to maintain you. And so if you're extroverted, you're going to look for a social niche because you like to be around people. And if you're introverted, you're going to spend much more time on your own. And so if you're an introverted person, for example, you're going to want a job where you're not selling and where you're not surrounded by groups of people who are making social demands on you all the time because it'll wear you out. Whereas if you're extroverted, that's just exactly what you want. And so the extrovert sees the world as a place of social opportunity. And the introvert sees the world as a place to retreat from and spend time alone. And it turns out that both of those modes of being are valid. The issue, at least to some degree, is whether or not you're fortunate enough to match your temperament with the demands of the environment.
If you're going to speak about something, you need to know a lot about it. You need to know 3 or 4 times as much as you're going to speak about at minimum. So first of all, you have to do your background research. You have to have multiple stories at hand that you can use to illustrate your point. And you have to have a point. You have to organize what you're talking about around a problem. So before I go on stage to speak on my tour, I always sit for half an hour, some of which involves usually about 5 minutes of anxiety. And I think, okay, there's a problem I'm trying to address tonight, a central problem or a theme. What is it? It might be courage. It might be responsibility. It might be meaning. That serves as an organizing principle. So that would be the point. And then basically I organize, say, a dozen stories around that. And I can kind of arrange them as a journey. And it's a journey that circles the main point. And so I'm trying to explore it, to say what I think about courage, let's say, but to take what I'm thinking farther than I've taken it already. And so then I can plot out, little 5-minute stories that I have that are associated with courage. And then I can talk to the audience. And I would say, talk about what you know. Use your personal experience, because that's something that you're actually a master of. You can bring in other material, but it has to be tied to the real world through your own experience. Otherwise, it's not real. It's also very good to speak directly to the audience, to the individuals in the audience, because I'm always looking at a single person, one after another, and focusing on them and talking to them, just like you'd have a conversation with someone. And that way I can see if they're following along. And I'm always listening to the audience. What I really like to hear from the audience is no noise at all, silence. Because if the audience, especially, if it's a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand people, if the audience is dead silent, then I know that I'm on the right track. And the other thing I would say is you're telling stories. So every fact that you relate, or every set of facts, has to be tied to a story. There has to be a meaningful output, which is something like, why is it important to your life that you know this fact? How is it related to how you're going to conduct yourself moving forward, or how you're going to see the world? Because that's kind of the essence of meaning. How does this fact change the way you perceive the world or act in the world? That's the meaning of the fact. And facts without meaning are dull. So you need to know that. You need to tell the truth. That's for sure. And I mean, for me, my talks are really, they're an attempt to explore a set of ideas in the most truthful way that I can manage. And that's also an adventure, because letting yourself speak freely about a topic, you don't always know where it's going to go. And so, but that also hooks in the audience, because they're not
they're along for the ride, right? And there's a risk. The risk is you might forget where you are, you might lose the thread, you might say something you regret, you might get confused. The talk should be a process of exploration, like a journey that you're taking the audience along on. It's the same when you're reading a novel. Like a great novel isn't exactly plotted out from beginning to end to begin with. The author is taking himself or herself and you on an intellectual adventure through the character development, and the characters have to be allowed to live and to express themselves, and the novel needs to unfold. It's like a colloquy between the conscious mind and the unconscious source of inspiration, and the novel is actually a journey through a characterological landscape, and the author shouldn't know where he or she's going to end up at the beginning. Same with an artist who's writing a song or a piece of music or a piece of visual art. There has to be play and exploration along the way. And so you also don't want to deliver an over-prepared talk, in my estimation, or at least that's not how I do it. You want to have a theme, you want to have a body of knowledge from which you can draw on, and then you want to be actively exploring the idea in front of the audience. And that's very gripping for everyone, including you. And you should learn something from the talk. It's an opportunity to think on your feet. Anyways, that's my style of lecturing. It's a trapeze act without a safety net, I would say. And that's part of what makes it gripping, is that there's a high probability of failure. And I would say with any performance that's going to be gripping, there has to be a high probability of failure. And that's why I don't speak with notes. If you speak with notes, which you might have to if you're a beginning speaker, then you cannot fail because you can always read the notes. And so there's a net. You'll fall in the net, but you won't die. But you'll never do anything spectacular. So that's the thing, is if you're going to do something spectacular, you have to take the risk. And if you're going to take the risk, you have to think on your feet. And then you also have to have something to think about. You have to be working on this material. You know, I've been working on the stuff I talk about for 30 years, for tens of thousands of hours. And so I have that reservoir of knowledge, I suppose. And whenever I read something new, I'm slotting it into the knowledge structure that I use to generate my talks. And I'm reading all the time. And lots of the things I read, I forget. They're not relevant to my central mission, whatever that happens to be. Look, something like the delineation of the relationship between responsibility and meaning, and maybe responsibility, meaning, and perception. It's something like that. And so I have a central concern, or deeper than that in some sense. My central concern was how to ensure personally that if I was tempted in a situation like the situations that arose in the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, that I wouldn't fall prey to those totalitarian systems and act in the reprehensible manner that so many people acted in. That's really been a driving concern of mine. And that bleeds over into the relationship between meaning and responsibility and perception. So there's a core set of problems that I'm working on, and every talk is an attempt to further develop those. So you also have to have a problem, you know? You think, well, you don't want to have a problem. It's like, yeah, you do. You've got problems anyways. If you're alive, you've got problems. Pick one of them. It can be your problem, and that can be the problem you try to address, whatever that happens to be. And then you have something to talk about. How am I going to address this problem? How can this problem be addressed? So you need to have a problem too if you're going to talk, just like you need to have a problem if you're going to write, because the writing is an attempt to solve the problem. And so is the talking. If you're not trying to solve a problem, what the hell are you doing talking? Why should anyone care? It's got to be a real problem too, like a nail biter of a problem, a dragon of a problem. And if it's a problem that everyone else shares, so much the better. And then you grapple with it. Put your life together and make something better. That's the way to defeat nostalgia for the false past. And don't be so sure you can't do it. I might say, well, what do you want to do with your life? And you think, oh my God, I can't answer that question. It's like, that's a big question. And so you don't know. Part of the problem is it's not a very good question. It's not differentiated enough. So if you ask yourself a question that's so large you can't answer it, well, then you should ask yourself a smaller question. And so in this program, you're asked to do things. We tried to make it practical. It's like, okay, it's 3 to 5 years down the road, and you get to have what you need and want within reason, right? Assuming you're taking care of yourself within reason. Well, what might you want? How would you like your family interactions to be going? Siblings, parents? What about your intimate relationship? If you could have what you wanted and needed from that, just what would that look like, hypothetically? Your career or your job, because those aren't the same thing. At least maybe you could have a job that is respectable and that constitutes a valid contribution to those around you and helps justify your position in society. And perhaps you could even have a career, that has some intrinsic meaning independently of that. Your education, your resistance to the temptation of drugs and alcohol and the sorts of things that knock people off the track, your care for yourself mentally and physically, your use of time productively and in an engaging manner outside of work. You could have what you wanted. What would it be? Answer it. Guess if you have to. And then write for 20 minutes about what your life could be like if all of that manifested itself. And then do the reverse. Write about what your life would be like in 3 to 5 years if you let everything about you that isn't good have full sway and take you to your own little subdivision of hell. And people are pretty aware of that. Everyone knows. Everyone I've ever talked to has some real sense of how they would degenerate if they degenerated in their own particular way. Some people would become cruel. Some people would become homicidal. Some people would become alcoholic. Some people would end up on the street. Some people would drift into prostitution. People know where their weaknesses are likely to tempt them and take them. And so then you sketch out a little hell and a little heaven, and maybe you're motivated to run from the one, which is good, and to run toward the other. And so then you have a framework for your life. And then maybe you make a strategic plan. Well, we've done that now with thousands of people in Holland and in Canada, mostly university students, well, all university students in the research studies. And we found at this little college in Canada, Mohawk College, that if you brought students in the summer in their orientation and just had them do this program, which should probably take you about 5 days if you did it thoroughly, if you had them do it really badly in an hour, that decreased the probability that the men would drop out in the first semester by 50%. It was a staggering finding, and we found findings of similar magnitude across the other studies. And the reason I'm telling you this is because a lot of the reason that people don't get what they want is because they don't aim at it.
I swore that I would stop lying. I said, I'm going to try not to say anything I know to be untrue. That doesn't mean I swore to tell the truth, because truth, that's hard. But you can consciously stop lying when you know you're lying. You can stop doing that. And that has been revolutionary for me. And one of the things I've really realized in recent years, and this is very much worth knowing, is that many times when people speak to each other, they have an agenda in mind. You want something from someone. Maybe you want a job, and you want to craft your image to get the job, right? So you say what you need to say to get what you think you need. The problem with that is, what do you know about what you need? You're so accurate about that, are you? And you think you know what you need exactly, and so you're going to falsify your utterances to bring about the desired end. And you're going to use the other person as a target of your manipulation. Well, that's like you write an essay because that's what the professor wants to hear. It's like you don't do that because you don't falsify your words, because hypothetically they're divine and the whole stability of the state rests on them, hypothetically, and maybe really too. And so you don't do that. And so instead you strive to tell the truth, and maybe that's an aim too. And then it's an adventure, because I'll tell you one thing. If you tell the truth, you have no idea what's going to happen to you. Because you have to let go of that. It's like, I'm going to say what I think. And then what I'm going to assume, faith, I'm going to assume that whatever happens, if I am telling the truth, is the best thing that could happen. Because the truth brings about what is best. And even if it looks hard for me, because it might be, because people take the easy way out often when they lie, even if it looks bad for me, that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means I don't see the whole picture. And if you believe that the truth will set you free and that there is such a thing as the truth and that the truth is redemptive, then you're pretty much stuck with that conclusion. But one of the remarkable things about that, and this really is worth knowing, is that if you do that, you will have your adventure. right? That's the Abrahamic adventure, you know? The call from God that justifies your life because of the excitement of what you're doing. And the truth does that. And then, if it's the truth, man, it's your adventure. Because what bloody adventure are you having if you tell someone else's story? It's not yours. And maybe if it's not yours, it's not good enough for you. And then you suffer, and then you're bitter, and then you're cruel, and then you're resentful. That's not good, or you get arrogant. So you break up your life, into practicalities, your career, your education, your intimate relationship, your marriage, your friendship. Hopefully your intimate relationship and your marriage are the same thing. Your use of time outside work, your civic duty, and you develop an image for yourself, a vision for yourself on all those fronts, and assume that you can have, with the proper sacrifices, what you need and want. And then I'll say something interesting about that, because that's the pursuit of goods in a practical way, right? And what's valuable in a practical way, in an implementable way. And you pick those pathways and you dedicate yourself to their optimization along any of those axes. And then you learn to optimize an aim. And then you see, once you've learned to optimize an aim across a set of goods, you start to aim at what unites those goods. Because that's what makes goods good. It's whatever is common across a set of goods. That's the highest good or a higher good. And so by practicing any good in any rigorous sense and making the proper sacrifices in that direction, you simultaneously learn to approach the good that is the sum or the essence of all those proximal goods. And I would say that the essential insistence in Christianity is that the good that unites all those goods is the same good that's reflected in the image of Christ, which is an image of acceptance of the suffering of life and the necessity of serving the lowest as the highest calling. And that's something, and it might be true, like really, actually, 100% true, more true than anything else, and I actually think it is. If it is true, and if that is real, then why in the world would you ever attempt to do anything else? And it's kind of earth-shattering in some sense to take this with real seriousness, It's all very frightening. If you're not afraid of that vision, and what it implies for you and your soul, then you didn't understand it. But it's also an unbelievably, what would you say, endlessly promising vision of what your life could be. And you might think, well, I need a life so rich that I can justify its suffering. And that's really asking for something, because there's no shortage of suffering in life. And no one thinks their own suffering isn't real. And maybe there's a possibility that there's some aim that's so high that the attempt alone to move in that direction is of sufficient value to act as a panacea for the suffering. And so you could say at the end of your life, oh my God, that was so hard. It was worth it. And so that's the choice you make at the crossroads. If you have any sense.
There's this idea in the New Testament, if you knock, the door will open. You think, well, that's an unbelievably, naively optimistic statement that no one in their right mind would possibly give any credence to. But the world is a very strange place. And it is the case that your perceptions of the world and the personality that you inhabit orients itself around your fundamental goal. You're goal-directed creatures. You look forward. We point at everything. Like we're arrows that are aimed at, we're either aimed at something or at nothing, but we have to be aimed. And if you aim at something, then the probability that something will come out of that is radically enhanced. And it might not even be what you aim at to begin with, but that's okay, because what do you know? Like, you might be aiming wrong. If you aim and then move forward, your perspective will change, and then maybe you can shift your aim, and that's fine, but at least you're moving forward. And then the future you want to create is the future that you create. And you might as well create it, because you don't have anything better to do. The other thing that's so important to realize, and this is part of the issue with regards to fragility, is you're all in on this game. You've already staked your life on it. And so you, as far as I can tell, you might as well stake your life on something that you regard as worthwhile, because you're staking your life anyways. And what's the alternative? You're going to stake your life on something you don't think is worthwhile? It's like, how is that an improvement? There's no improvement in that. And so if you want to plow a better pathway forward, then get out the plow and start working it. And that works way better than, it works way better than you would think. I've often wondered, and I think it's a reasonable thing to wonder, is like, we're not doing too bad in this world, you know, things are a lot better than they were 50 years ago, and there's a lot of reason to be optimistic, and there's reason to be pessimistic. But, you know, it's not like we're all in making things better. We're maybe 60-40 or 65-35 or something like that, each of us individually and then also collectively. You wonder what would happen if we were all in, just how much better we could make things. And there's something that's worth thinking about. There's something to devote yourself to. It's like, how much suffering could you rectify if that was your goal? Your own and other people's as well. And how much malevolence could you constrain? And what amount of good could you do in the world? That's a noble goal, and it's certainly something worth discovering, unless you have something better to do. And it doesn't seem to me that you do. So, especially when you think about good, as not as something that's associated with naive adherence to a set of constraining rules, you know, that all good is obedience. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm saying, look, there's problems that are out there in the world, and some of those problems bother you. They're your problems. Right? I don't know why they bother you, and some other problems bother someone else, but there are problems that bother you. Those are your problems. Right? That's your call to adventure. Solve them. And see who you are.